Okay, urban. We're going to finish up urban today. So that means, do you know what this means? These are the last notes of the year. Hooray! So what we're mostly going to talk about today is sustainability efforts in urban areas and problems that have risen because of the way urban areas have grown up and how we manage them. So 6.8 is urban sustainability. We're going to talk about the attitudes and the values of the population and the balance of power reflected in the built landscape. That is the enduring understanding. Um, they want you to be able to identify the different urban design initiatives and practices like new urbanism, green belts, slow growth cities, smart growth policies, walkability, transportation-oriented development, mixed land use, all of those things. It's important to understand America when you are thinking through these concepts. If you have lived in a place like Shenzhen, China for most of your life, these items that are not normal in America don't seem so special. The idea that we all, in Shenzhen, all the neighborhoods are mixed use. There's residential, there are shops that sell chains for your fishing boat next door to shops that sell vegetables next door to the nail place, right? In America, we don't really do it that way. We have very zoned areas of residential, zoned areas of commercial, zoned areas of industrial. And so the goal in a lot of places like America is to sustain a city in much the way that places like China have always sustained a city, is build complexes where I can go downstairs and get most of what I need and I don't need a car. And so this is the sustainability ideas that might seem like, well, everybody does that to you, but not everybody does that. Excuse me. No, I don't have the coronavirus, don't worry. I just have a frog in my throat. Okay, so sustainability, just like we talked about in development, it applies in all sorts of places. It's the way that we can make sure things happen for the long term. So with this virus, for example, the social distancing that China put into place seemed a little crazy at first, but now that I see how it's playing out in other countries, it has made this virus sustainable in a way. It has lessened the impact of the virus and spread it out over time so that the infrastructure of China's medical care system can cope, right? If everybody who got sick with the virus got sick with it at the same time, there wouldn't be enough hospital beds to care for them. The virus is not gone. This is March 11th, March 12th maybe. It's not gone. I think we're still going to see cases throughout the next several months. But because the cases are a manageable number, the hospitals have enough beds and enough nurses and enough doctors and enough equipment to care for them. If everybody got sick all at once, it would not be sustainable. So it's long-term viability. How can we make sure what we're building, what we're doing, what we're eating, the energy we're using is okay for the long term? So most of the world is starting to think about how to make urban landscapes sustainable because, as we have talked about over and over in this class, urban population is going to continue to rise and rise and rise and rise and rise. So there are some new concepts shaping the debate about city landscapes around the world that we will talk about today. So some of these concepts are designed to fight urban sprawl, also called suburban sprawl. I don't see this very much in Asia. I don't see it very much even in Europe. It's a concept that is really prevalent in America if you've ever driven through a place like Houston, Texas. And it's just spread out because it has room to spread out. So in places where there's room to spread out, we don't spread up. Places like China, where there's not as much room to spread out because of mountains and rivers, or need to be accessible to the ocean or the ports, we live on top of each other. Hong Kong has no landmass, so everybody lives on top of each other. But in places with landmass, we tend to spread out. And so one of the ways they're trying to limit that is this concept of green belts. We already talked about green belts in the agriculture chapter when we were talking about von Thunen. Remember that the ring of the von Thunen circle, the second ring of the circle, the first ring is the market gardening. The second ring is forests because when he created the model, they needed lumber to build things and to burn for fuel. And it's heavy. So the transportation cost was really expensive. So they wanted that forest ring to be really close to the market center. So some of those forest rings still exist. And they are preserving them not because they need the wood to burn, but because it prevents urban sprawl. It prevents the city from spreading out too far and making the land mass that it covers unsustainable. And you might be thinking, why is it bad for a city to spread out so far? Well, if we cover the entire earth with concrete, it's really going to affect the environment. It's really going to affect runoff and flooding. Shenzhen is not sprawled, but when it rains, we flood. We have these red rain days, right? Maybe let's have a red rain day again. That would be an exciting thing to have on top of a coronavirus quarantine. Right, so these green belts, as you can see in the map there, the surrounding, that's London down there, and then there's a green belt surrounding London to prevent London from spreading too far. If we have just consistent cities all the way through a place, we won't have enough farmland, we won't have enough recreation land, and the environment will not be sustainable for human life. So cities and regions and counties and other types of government zone areas and refuse to allow development to happen there. And so it helps discourage and limit the sprawl. The green space provides a barrier between the outlying land and the central business district, the CBD, and creates connective infrastructure, or actually interferes with connective infrastructure that would make it easy for me to live 70 miles outside of town and get on a fast train to get into town. And so it minimizes environmental impact and it slows the growth of a city. And so you would, instead of growing out, cities are forced to grow up, which is more environmentally friendly. So this is called slow growth cities. So both urban sprawl, green belts, and slow growth cities are vocabulary terms on this slide. Similar idea called smart growth is the same concept. It's when a city legally says this is how we're going to grow and this is how it's going to work, and we're going to make sure we prevent farmland from being developed into things that are not environmentally friendly. So cities are not legally allowed to annex land in areas that are declared off limits. So you see in the picture there, a conventional development would really parcel up that farmland and create more concrete and more environmental impact than what you see on the right side. So the conventional is much more concrete-based and urban sprawly, and what's on the right is much more natural and preserving of farmland. So in the United States, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Washington, Tennessee, and Oregon all have enacted smart growth laws, and those laws will spread. They will hit smaller states first, states that don't have as much space to spread out in, but also states that are very environmentally ahead of their times, like Washington State and Oregon up in the Pacific Northwest, right? Seattle and Portland, Oregon. The governments there are very, very environmental sustainability concerned because of the populations that live there. And so the populations that live there are concerned about the environment. They tend to elect elected officials who are concerned about the environment. So the environmental programs in Washington State and Oregon tend to be very progressive. New Jersey and Rhode Island have done it because they're tiny. Tennessee's kind of an outlier. Tennessee is kind of close to the Midwest. It's a southern state, but it is progressive in the sense that it's trying to protect some of its farmland. All right, new urbanism is a movement that should be bolded. Sorry. So new urbanism, make sure that's a vocabulary word for you. It started in urban planning in the 1990s, and they're just trying to reduce sprawl. And it really is what we have here, these idea of mixed-use neighborhoods. There's no clear separation between residential and commercial areas. It's a mix of homes and businesses. So a variety of sizes and price ranges to try to create social diversity. It's what we have here. I live in an apartment complex that's fairly nice. The apartment complex across the street is not that nice. So the people that live there are not as wealthy, perhaps, as I am. But I see them and I interact with them and I shop at the same stores with them. And so it's trying to create a society where we mix and mingle with people who aren't like us. And when we mix and mingle with people who aren't like us, we tend to become more tolerant and more accepting of those who aren't like us. So it's a social sustainability idea, but then it's also an environmental sustainable idea. So new urbanism should be bolded there, mixed-use neighborhoods. Just remember it's where we live, in Shenzhen. You can walk out of your apartment and buy a Coke at the convenience store that's probably underneath your apartment. That and 3 vet stores and a nail place and a place to get tea, and a stationery store. And in my neighborhood, I live in Old Sheko, all sorts of places to make sure my fishing boat is in good shape. All right, the next learning objective, the effects of different urban designs and practices. So these are the effects of new urbanism and the obstacles that new urbanism has faced. So the essential knowledge is phrased: praise for urban design initiatives include the reduction of urban sprawl, improved walkability and transportation, improved and diverse housing options, improved livability and promotion of sustainable options. Those are all the good things about new urbanism, which should be a vocabulary word. However, there are some bad things, and they're listed here. Increased housing costs. We'll talk about that a lot today when we talk about oh, I've forgotten it. Not gerrymandering, it's another G word. Gentrification, there we go. Increased housing costs, possible de facto segregation. If you force people out of a neighborhood they can't afford, then it becomes just like a suburb filled with wealthy people who can afford it. And the potential loss of historical place or character. So if there's an old cool building and it's knocked down to create this giant skyscraper that a lot of people can live in, it affects how the town feels. And so new urbanism in and of itself faces two large obstacles in America. There's a very strict existence of zoning. They don't allow commercial and residential to be cuddled up together. So all of those zoning regulations have to be broken down in city and local governments. And that often takes a really long time, and residents maybe don't want a 7-Eleven right next door to them, because who's going to go to the 7-Eleven and rob it at midnight? Then they'll come next door and rob my house, and I don't want that, right? Not in my backyard. That's a phrase you might see around the internet if you are looking at certain Reddit threads. NIMBY, N-I-M-B-Y, not in my backyard. It's why we don't want prisons near us. It's why we don't want convenience stores where the types of people we don't want to mix with might shop. And so that's a giant obstacle. The people who already live in these areas want to keep it exactly the way it is. And then there's public opinion, and they just don't want to change. I'm used to it this way, we've done it this way for years, and new urbanism is not an improvement. Yes? All right, 6.8, done. 6.9 next, then 6.10, that's 6.11, and then we'll be done with notes. Woo! Urban data. This one's real short, and we've already talked about it. Quantitative and qualitative. So they want you to re-understand, as it applies to urban areas, how qualitative and quantitative data are used to show the causes and effects of geographic change within urban areas. We've already talked about this in the first unit when we talked about GIS and GPS, right? So remember that GPS is a locational program. If I want to find my way from here to secondary campus, my little phone will put my little dot on a map and it'll show me where to go. But that little dot on the map, I can also see where certain stores are, I can see where parks are, I can see where hospitals are. So there are layers, there are GIS layers on that map. Here's where the hospitals are, here's where the stores are, here's where the coffee shops are. And on my little GPS program, I can turn on and off those layers to figure out where those things are. So GIS, remember, is the layers. Think of it as a sandwich. And so if I want to determine why my elm trees are dying, I will put my layer of elm trees in, and then on the layer over that I will put all my other different kinds of trees and other data that might be important, like where cars drive, like where students tend to cut across the lawn. And I can pull those layers in and out until I can find a pattern that may explain why all my elm trees are dying. So quantitative and qualitative data. So GIS usually does quantitative data. It's real hard data without interpretation. Qualitative data is how we feel about things. Quantitative is the numbers, qualitative is the quality, how we feel. So when we're looking at the quantitative data of the COVID-19 virus, we're looking at where the cases are, right, and how they're spreading. That's the quantitative data. The qualitative data is how people are feeling about it, how it's affecting larger concepts of diversity and economic equality. That's all qualitative. It's narratives and field studies and what people are thinking and feeling. So make sure you remember that population data, it comes from the census, and we're having a census in the United States in 2020, and that will cause some redistricting, because each congressional district in the United States needs to have about the same number of people in it. And when we redistrict with political intent, that's called gerrymandering, right? So the census provides a picture of where people live, but it can also provide their incomes, their family sizes, and other details. And so researchers and businesses can use census data to figure out where to put their goods and services. If I want to use central place theory and I want to open up my tea shop, I need to know where to put my tea shop based on where people are living and where the other tea shops are. All right? So census data is available at many scales of analysis. Make sure you understand the difference between scales of analysis and map scale. They can be related, but they're two different things. Remember from Unit 1, map scale is large scale or small scale, right? Small scale shows you the least amount of detail. So a small scale map is a globe, right? Even though it's showing so much land area, it's not showing you much detail at all because it can't, because they're trying to fit too much on the page. A large scale map shows you a smaller land area with a lot more detail, like a map of Shenzhen, right? That's a map scale. A scale of analysis is how you're looking at things. So it can be related to map scale, but if you look at coronavirus, I know I'm mentioning it a lot, but it's on everybody's mind, so why not? If you look at the scale of how this thing has broken out on a worldwide scale, you're looking at something different than if you look at Shenzhen, right? So if we just look at Shenzhen, maybe it doesn't look so bad anymore, right? There's 12.5 million people in the city. There's been a total of about 420 cases overall. Only 3 people have died. No problem. This is not anything to worry about. But then you have to scale of analysis out from a city level to a country level to see how big of a problem it was in China, and then even further out to see how big of a problem it's going to become globally. So the census data is available at many scales of analysis. You can look at a census tract, which is a geographic region, or you can look at a census block, or you can look at it as a city, you can look at it as a county. So a census tract is a small region between 4,000 and 12,000 people. Right? And then the census block is even smaller than that, right? So there are certain numbers of blocks in each tract, and then those tracts are put into the whole. So the scale of analysis of a census block is going to give you a totally different picture. Maybe everybody in that census block is, I don't know, works at Microsoft and has high levels of education. So you can see how that census block, how those people are clumping, but then you can zoom out a little bit and look at a census tract and see that around maybe the census block of high-earning white-collar workers, there is a working-class neighborhood. So you can zoom in and out of your scales of analysis and look at things a different way. If you only look at something from one perspective, if you only look at Shenzhen and the coronavirus, you will not be panicking at all. But then if you start looking at the whole world, that's a different scale of analysis, and it gives you a different picture of the situation. All right, qualitative data. Look, there's a GIS, right? Remember GIS? It's these scales, so there's your physical space. Economic status would be a layer that you could pull in and out. Family status would be a layer that you could pull in and out. How many people, whether they're married or not married, grandparents living with them, not living with them, how many children. And then ethnic status you could pull in and out so that you can see the patterns. And then qualitative data would be questionnaires. How are you feeling? How are you doing with online school? Right? So we have quantitative data right now with you guys on whether you're signing into Moodle and whether you're turning in your assignments. But the qualitative data is, how are you doing? And how is this working? And this is all crazy. And is everybody okay? So when you combine the qualitative data with the quantitative data, you can get a better analysis of what's really going on. And when you do that with population data in urban areas, you get something called a social area analysis, and you gain more understanding of what's really happening, how the lives work, how the characteristics of people work, and how they are functioning in the space. Yes? All right, 6:10. There's only 2 more to go, but we've got many, many slides. These ones are not as short as the ones we just did. So the challenges of urban changes. These are the things that make it hard, things that don't go so well, things that don't work out very well, the causes and effects of geographic change in urban areas. There's a lot of essential knowledge here, and there's a lot of vocabulary. So our first essential knowledge is going to talk about housing discrimination, redlining, block busting, and affordability, access to services, rising crime, environmental justice, the growth of disamenity zones or zones of abandonment. We're also going to talk about squatter settlements. Then we'll talk about inclusionary zoning and local food movements, and then urban renewal and gentrification, and then how governments can help or harm that. So much of this we've already kind of talked about when we talked about population issues, when we talked about agriculture. So this is just looking at some of these concepts from an urban area perspective. Right, so do remember that cities are nodes, right? So they form the center of a functional region, which is around a node. And so if I need certain services and certain elements of transportation, the city is my node. I can't get an airplane out of a tiny little town somewhere. I have to come to a city to do that. So they are often centers of innovation, cultural diversity and art, economic growth, centers of political power. They are also growingly places of poverty, violence, and environmental decay, that cities are not ready for the exponential growth of the population that's coming into it, so they don't have the infrastructure needed or the services needed to keep everybody safe and healthy in that way. So as globally the percentage of people living in cities continues to grow, the understanding of how to solve urban challenges is really important work for the future. All right, so the root of most challenges is economic. In most more developed countries, cities have changed rapidly from centers of industry during the Industrial Revolution to centers of services, right? And we've talked about this already. It upsets the economic balance. If my city has grown because I have a lot of industry there, and I transfer to a service economy, a lot of people are going to be unemployed suddenly. Right? And so you can kind of watch China doing this in a slow, maybe kind of painless way. They are trying to educate their youth to be more service economy ready, and so that they can transition and send their manufacturing elsewhere so that they can become a service economy. In less developed countries, cities have grown too quickly, and so they're overpopulated, and that upsets the economic balance. So that picture right there, that's Shenzhen at the top in 1964, and Shenzhen at the bottom now. And it was nothing. It was nothing until 1990 or so, or probably 1985, it started being built. And 1964 is not a very long time. I mean, for you guys, it probably seems like forever ago. But 60 years is not a very long time in the grand scheme of things. For a city to have grown from what you see on the top to a city of 12.5 million in 60 years is amazing. However, Shenzhen grew with a plan. China designed it to become the city that it is. So more than a lot of other urban areas in the world, it has a plan. Parts of it don't work, but parts of it do. So urban areas that don't have a plan, we tend to have giant problems. So wealthy people live in cities, so do poor people. And in most cities in the world, particularly this is true in America, actually the term inner city is just true in countries that have cities designs like America. So it's the inner city, which is the regions just outside the CBD. In our Latin American model, in our European model, this is not true. The inner city is where all the wealthy people live, right? But in America, all the wealthy people have fled to the suburbs, so our inner city becomes a shanty town. So the inner city in North American model is that ring just outside the CBD. In Europe, it's farther out. It's the peripheral suburbs out there, and also in places that are growing quickly, like Africa, right? And so we have these areas that aren't connected to services, that are horrendously impoverished, called a variety of different words that you need to recognize. Shantytown, squatter settlement, favela, right? All of these describe what you're seeing in the picture there on the left, is just really close to that shiny, sparkling city in the sky is a pile of people who are living in horrid conditions. And according to the UN, 1/6 of the world's population lives in urban poverty. And most of that poverty is in LDCs, right? But where that poverty happens in the city model is different. Make sure you understand that. In America, the poverty is in a ring around the downtown area. In Europe, it's on the edges of the city. In the Asian model, it's little spots here and there throughout the city, right? So, underclass is a vocabulary term. I hate this term, but it's a word that we use. It's poor urban residents who face social hardships and contribute to their poverty, the underclass, right? You see upper class and lower class, right? And so the wealthy, the connected, the educated have much more privilege than the non-wealthy, the non-educated, the non-connected. And we're seeing this play out in many places, particularly in America with the coronavirus, right? One of the smartest things China did was China does not have universal health care. So in that way, it's very similar to the United States. A lot of people in China struggle to get access to proper care. But China made testing for the virus and treatment for the virus free if your insurance didn't pay for it, which blasted down the barriers for people seeking care. The underclass, quote unquote, in China was able to go if they had a fever and get diagnosed if they needed to. In America, they haven't done that yet. So the underclass is not seeking medical assistance because they don't have insurance and it will bankrupt them if they go to the hospital, right? So a lot of people in America don't have insurance and just kind of ride things out at home. And if you ride coronavirus out at home, you're going to get 2 to 5 more people sick. And so this culture of poverty is really causing, or will cause, the spread of, in my opinion, the spread of coronavirus in places where medical care hasn't engaged in ways to make sure everybody who wants to seek treatment can seek treatment. So the culture of poverty is a persistent way of living and reflects a lack of income and a lack of accumulated wealth. This is also a problem with the virus, as things in America, this is Thursday, what today's day? This is Thursday, March 12th. I'm watching the news come in from America this morning, and they're shutting everything down. And all my friends are panicking. And my more privileged friends are excited about being quarantined for a couple of weeks. But my friends who live paycheck to paycheck or live in a gig economy, they're going to go broke, right? And in China, I have read in a couple places that the Chinese government is offering payouts to store owners and other workers who have lost income because of the fact we've been shut down for almost 2 months. But the government in America is not yet offering anything like that. So people are panicking about the virus, but then also about economic shock. A lot of my friends and compadres don't have savings to fall back on. They live paycheck to paycheck. And they seem wealthy. They have cars and houses and video games and clothes. I mean, it's fine, but it's all very tenuous, right? And so if things just change just a little bit, things could go awry. If they get sick or if they miss work, they don't have enough money to last out a long quarantine. So it's really going to upset the economic balance in America specifically, and in other countries where people operate the same way. So there's, in America and in other places, the culture of poverty results in a shortage of inexpensive housing. And so a person has to spend a high percentage of their income on rent or mortgage. In the States, the house I owned, my whole paycheck for the month went towards our mortgage. We lived on Mr. Blackwood's paycheck. And so if I suddenly lost my job, we couldn't pay our mortgage without not buying groceries or not paying for our cars or whatever else, all these expenses coming out of Mr. Blackwood's paycheck. And so that shortage of inexpensive, livable housing is a problem. And the culture of poverty is political power isn't centered there. So people who are poor do not have political power. So there are poor neighborhoods and inadequately funded schools. Schools are funded by tax dollars. And so if a neighborhood income level is low, the tax dollar level is low, and those schools are underfunded, and those kids don't get as good of an education as the kids that live in a wealthier neighborhood. Underclass neighborhoods are often physically, spatially located on the map very far from jobs that are available. And so they don't have, in America particularly, we don't have a vibrant public transportation system in a lot of places. So if I don't have a car, I can't get to work. And I can't afford a car unless I can get to work. But I don't have a car, so I can't get to work. It's this cycle of poverty. The underclass can't get credit. In America, we have predatory loan operations, these paycheck loans where you borrow in advance and they charge you enormous amounts of interest, and then you can never pay it back, and so you're stuck in this cycle of debt. So that there's these loans, and banks won't loan people without good collateral and good credit money because they're too high of a risk. So it's something that keeps people in a cycle of poverty. So that these payday type loans prey on the underclass. And then we have food deserts, which we talked about in the agriculture unit. These areas of cities where there's just no food or crap, right? Twinkies and Coca-Cola. And if you don't have a car, you can't get to the good food. If you don't have money, you can't get to the good food, right? And so these are all challenges of urban areas. There's also something called filtering. This is when you change a house from a single-family home and you convert it to be rental units. I don't see that wandering around this town, but obviously I haven't seen very much of this town. It's an enormous town, and I only know a small percentage of it. This was also not very typical in Morocco. But in America, there's all these neighborhoods that were the suburbs in the streetcar era, right? When the map was pinwheel shaped, and then as the wealthier class has moved out, those homes that they built in the 1920s and 30s now have been divided into 4 or 5 apartments, right? So that what you see in the picture there on the left is a single family home that has been converted into, I think, I would guess it's been converted into 4 apartments, because you see the front, the bottom door there, that's 1 apartment, and then the door up there is another apartment. I bet the stairs go up on the left side of the house, and then I bet on the right side of the house and in the back of the house there are 2 more apartments. And so as filtering happens on a scale of a single house, a wealthy family moves out, and they still own the house, but they can make more money if they can charge more rent, so they divide it so more people can live there. And then the building deteriorates over time, but the absentee landlords don't care. The neighborhood around it becomes less desirable, and the residents of the building become poorer and poorer, and you can divide it even further and further. That's called filtering. Yes? All right, racial segregation and institutional racism. This is a giant problem in the United States for sure. So in the era of the Jim Crow laws after the Civil War in America, it was similar to apartheid in South Africa, not exactly the same. But until the 1960s, there were African Americans couldn't attend the same schools as non-African Americans. They couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. And so the racial segregation forces this cycle of poverty. If I am in a neighborhood, if I'm forced to live in a neighborhood where the schools are bad, my kids don't have a better chance than I had, right? And so that's called institutional racism, when the systematic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity benefits people who are white to the exclusion of people of color. And it is something that is a giant problem socially in America right now, the idea of white privilege, and a lot of white people saying, but I don't have privilege, I worked really hard for what I had, right? So I am a white middle-class American, and I did work really hard for what I had, but what I tend not to see, unless I really look, is how I was helped at every step of the way. How I was raised in a 2-parent home, and my dad earned enough money that my mom could stay home with us until I was in 3rd or 4th grade, so I had a parent at home. I never had to be in daycare. My mom was always there. She cooked lunch. And then when I did go to school, I lived in a neighborhood that was a wealthier neighborhood in a sense that the schools were good. I went to a college, a private college, but I got loans and scholarships that made that possible. And I wasn't a lone risk because I was a middle-class white kid, right? And so I worked hard, but I also had a lot of help along the way. And this is what's really hard, I think, sometimes for people to see, is that people that live and are born into situations that aren't as helpful, that don't have stairs already built in. So if I'm African American and I'm born in a neighborhood without good schools, I can't get into a good college. Plus, I have to probably support my family at some point, and the best way to support my family in some of these places is to join a gang and turn to a life of crime, right? Kids who are trying to walk the straight path still look like those other kids who joined the gang, and police who are patrolling that area have trouble distinguishing them in the culture sometimes, right? And so there's more police brutality in areas like this because police are trained to keep themselves safe. And in a neighborhood where 70% of the young men might have guns, it's hard to treat the 30% of those young men who don't differently because you don't have enough information, right? So that graph there is race in the Ferguson-Florissant School District. Ferguson is where, maybe 5 years ago, there was a shooting. Trayvon Martin is a Ferguson kid, and he was shot by a police officer, and it became kind of a rallying cry for racial equality in America. This graph, 75% of those kids are on free or reduced lunch, right? That means the school district pays for them. This is also another giant problem of the coronavirus. Schools are starting to close in America, but in places like the Ferguson-Florissant district, 75% of kids who can't go to school aren't going to get lunch that day, right? And for some of those kids, a lot of those kids, that's the only meal they get. So we close the schools and suddenly these kids are home. Their parents can't afford to stay home from work. And so suddenly they're without childcare, they're without food. It's a giant problem, right? And so the idea of social distancing and canceling school for places like Ferguson and Florissant are going to be enormous. The impact is going to be enormous. So politicians in those areas have to choose between keeping school open so that these kids have care and can eat, or closing school to keep everybody safe from a deadly virus. And it's a choice that I would not want to be in a position to make, right? Okay, blockbusting. It was I shouldn't laugh, it's a horrible thing, but the preys on fear. Like even before social media, blockbusting preyed on fear. And so I would be a happy white family in a happy white neighborhood, and then a black family would move in. Or somebody would hear a rumor that a black family was going to move in. And if a black family moves into my neighborhood in the 1950s and 60s, the value of my home goes down. And in the 1950s and 60s in America, the best way to save for retirement was owning a home. You owned a home, you paid your mortgage, eventually you owned it outright, and then when you were old, you sold it, and all that money that it was worth, and homes tend to increase in value, right? So the first house I bought in what year was that? 96. We paid 60,000 US dollars for, and then 3 years later we sold it for 100,000 US dollars, right? That's real money. And so mortgage equity in a home is a lot of ways that middle class white Americans in the 1950s and 60s were earning wealth so that they could retire. And if you interfere with the value of my house, you're interfering with me, and I want to sell as soon as I can so that I can go somewhere else where the value of my home will continue to rise. So that's blockbusting. So if a black family moved into a neighborhood, people would blockbust. Investors, who always make money off of people's fear, would reduce the neighborhood into a panic of quick selling. And I want to sell quick because it's going to plummet. So these investors would buy up these homes and then divide them up and filter them, right? And so blockbusting was something, also redlining, that really created the racial segregation that we still have in the United States. Even though it's not legal anymore, it is still institutional in a sense that banks encourage it and real estate transactions encourage it. All right, redlining was actually a governmental policy in the 1930s. They actually took a red marker and marked neighborhoods that federal banks would not loan money to for improvements, for infrastructure improvements, for housing improvements, because they were a bad risk. This happened during the 1930s in America, and it was just the federal banks. So it was the federal banks of America could not loan to these places that were redlined. So in the map there on the left, that red section right there of Baltimore, Maryland, was redlined. So they could loan to the places that were yellow and green, but they could not loan to those places in red. Well, says you, maybe that's not so bad because those non-federal banks would loan to them, but non-federal banks follow federal banks. If the federal banks thinks it's a bad risk, most other banks do too. So redlining really created whole pockets of cities that could not improve themselves, that did not have the finances to make them better. So it created an underclass of people who could not get loans to improve their neighborhoods and could not move to wealthier neighborhoods because of segregation. So this video here, Adam ruins everything. I will show you. He talks fast, but this is one of the best explanations of redlining that I can come up with. All right. So that's a little hardcore, but that really solidifies a lot of the things I've been talking through this whole unit. So if most of that went over your head, give it a rewatch. Watch it 4 times in a row because it really puts into 6 minutes or less a lot of the issues that cause economic problems in America and are important for understanding for the AP exam. All right, so in all areas of the world, there's segregation in other parts of the world as well, South Africa being one of the most prevalent and prominent. But the institutionalized segregation of America and South Africa continue to affect society to this day, even though it's illegal now. But segregated areas can sometimes become ghettos, or also disamenity zones. Disamenity zones, ghettos is another word for squatter settlement, for shantytown, for favela. So ghetto is a area of a city that is disconnected from services. Disamenity zones is another vocabulary word. This is like the same concept in 27 different words to describe it. They're not connected to city services, and they're under control of drug kingpins or gangs. In developing countries, disamenity zones are often physically in unsafe location. So they, like, the city's in the safe spot, and then people live up the hill or in the marshlands because that's the only space they have to live, and they need to be in the city for their jobs. So ghettos are areas of poverty separated by minority groups, and developing countries have them a lot, and they have them, as you see there in the picture on the side, up into the mountains where it's not very safe up there, and they're not well built, and a mudslide or a bad rainstorm could just wash it all out. So residents of ghettos and disamenity zones and shanty towns and squatter settlements, they often feel trapped because of social or political or economic factors, opportunity, and lack of services. They're trapped in that cycle of poverty, right? Sometimes a ghetto or a disamenity zone can become a zone of abandonment, so an area that has become deserted for economic or environmental reasons. In developed countries, this often happened when industry left an area, and so and there was nothing to replace it. There was no reason for other types of workers to move into that neighborhood. So we get these urban brownfields. Not only does the factory become a brownfield, but the residential area or the commercial area that surrounded the factory and was fed by the multiplier effect of the factory also becomes a brownfield. And brownfields devalue residential property. I don't want to live in a neighborhood that's mostly dead, so I move away too. And then all of these homes, so you can see that picture there, these beautiful homes that were once part of a beautiful neighborhood are just abandoned. Squatter settlements are technically when a city grows too quickly and people have to squat. They squat in a place. They don't own the property, but their physical presence there gives them right to the space. Squatter settlements are, they live in these poorly built homes, I guess for the lack of a better term to call them, poorly built shacks. There's an informal economy in a squatter settlement that the government really doesn't maintain. There aren't police services, there aren't fire services, there's not medical care. There's an informal economy of gangs who protect like police, or healers who try to heal like the hospitals do. But squatter settlements can be deadly. There's unhealthy air, they don't really have clean water, there's pollution, there's crime, there's terrorist activity, and epidemics and natural disasters are often much more deadly in these places because they don't have services. So if a COVID virus hits a squatter settlement, it's going to slam through it like crazy and kill everybody because they're not going to be able to go to the hospital. And so the positive thing so far about the COVID virus is places where squatter settlements are most prominent, which would be sub-Saharan Africa. It hasn't seemed to really get there yet. And so you keep your fingers crossed that it doesn't get there because it will be deadly. And much more deadly than it is in developed countries like China and the West and Korea. We talked about squatter settlements before, way back in Unit 1, when we watched the Geospatial Revolution, and they mapped Kibera, which is the squatter settlement outside in Ethiopia. And so a non-governmental organization came in and gave everybody GPS machines and tried to map the area so that they could include information about where to stay away from rapists and where to seek medical care and where to find the cleanest water. Inclusionary zoning requires or incentivizes, it means it rewards private developers to designate a certain percentage of their units in a given housing project to sell below market rate. So it opens up these types of housing areas to people who might not be able to afford it otherwise. It's very popular in the new urbanism, and it's actually one of the reasons that new urbanism is disliked by a lot of wealthier people because they want to use their wealth to isolate themselves as much as possible from people who are poorer than they are. And so it's one of the things that that prevents new urbanism from really working, is the wealthy's need and want to build a wall and not have to mix and mingle with people who are not as wealthy as they are. But inclusionary zoning is a popular tool for getting the private market to subsidize affordable housing. Critics also say the policy reduces the overall supply of housing overall, so it doesn't actually make housing affordable, it actually raises prices overall. And other anti-poverty critics say it's a band-aid and it doesn't really address the housing issues, but it is something that they are trying. And there's a long article there at that CityLab. I can't think today. You know, that link, there it is. CityLab web link that really talks beautifully about inclusionary zoning. Okay, challenges in urban areas, local food. We talked about local food in agriculture. We talk about it again here. It can be a reaction to the giant machine of commercial agriculture and globalization. As we talked about with the Green Revolution, our yields have increased, but we have also increased our use of fertilizers and irrigation and things that are environmentally detrimental. And so critics of local food, and I will quote this is in this Freakonomics article that is quoted below, unless the most basic laws of economics cease to hold, the smallholder farming future, this local farming that we're talking about, envisioned by this movement could jeopardize the natural habitat and climate change mitigation efforts while also endangering a tenuous and temporary victory in the battle against human hunger. So overall, for the larger, at a scale of analysis, a global scale of analysis, local farming could turn out to be a disaster. At a local scale of analysis, it provides local wealthier residents with the ability to get clean food. And so it is, again, a conflict between what is best for me as an individual versus what is best for the world at large, and nobody has the right answer. So here's a little video about local food movements.
In the 20th century, the United States witnessed the greatest migration in its history. But it wasn't new lands people were discovering. It was cities. By the end of the 20th century, nearly 80% of Americans lived in urban areas. And they no longer knew who grew their food. Then, something happened. People started saying, yes, in my backyard. They started growing food on city rooftops, on freeway off-ramps, and even in their own front yards. They raise farm animals on their balconies, milk them right in their own kitchens, and even keep their own bees. But can these people feed entire cities? No. Instead, it's about reconnecting people to where their food comes from. Reminding them that apples come from trees, that milk comes from cows, that chickens lay eggs, and that carrots actually grow in the ground, and that all of it requires people. When you discover where your food comes from, that someone cares for it, that someone grows it, then brings it to you, you develop a different way of looking at food. Urban farming reminds you that food has a face and a name, and it makes food real. To learn more about terms like
All right, I'm going to stop it there to make sure you understand that that video is the viewpoint of the local farming movement being a positive thing, and this Freakonomics article is from the viewpoint of the local farming movement not being as positive as it's made out to be. So Freakonomics is the con article, and the YouTube video that we just watched together was the pro article, right? Okay, so urban renewal involves renovating a site. So you take something that is abandoned, a kind of a brownfield maybe, or a disamenity zone, and you spice it up and make it better and make it prettier and encourage people to move into it. So it processes when it starts when an area is identified as blighted, and so eminent domain laws in the states, if an area is blighted, you can make people leave. You can say it's dangerous for you, and we need to do this thing that's going to help society as a whole. So the government can seize your property. They can pay you market value, but they don't pay you what you think it's worth or what the money that you've invested in it. So the movie Up, as I'm sure I've talked about before, is Carl just wouldn't leave. His area was probably labeled as blighted, and they were going to build this giant thing that was going to make a lot of money and urban renew his area, and he refused to leave. And until that, at the beginning of the movie, they're going to kick him out. He has to leave by the morning. They finally had gone through all the courts and pushed eminent domain into he was going to be arrested if he stayed. And so eminent domain often is used to build roads and highways through middle-class neighborhoods, but also hotels and hospitals and schools. It can help replace brownfields and low-quality housing with usable structures, but it can also remove people from the area that don't have any place else to go, right? So all of these things have positives and negatives. Everything we're talking about in this section of topics has giant positives and negatives. And so a lot of the problems with urban renewal is it gets rid of coolness, right? It gets rid of history, it gets rid of groovy old buildings. And so the before and after picture up there, this is an old neighborhood in its prime, probably in the 1940s, based on the cars and the clothing I see. And then it probably died, right? As people moved out to the suburbs, that area probably died in a sense that made it a zone of abandonment. And then they knocked it all down to build this soulless building and giant brick courtyard, right? So it can force poor people to leave their homes and communities. It can break up and eliminate historic neighborhoods. And private developers are often given tax break incentives, so that actually shifts the burden to other taxpayers. They get a break, but everybody else has to pay more because they got a break. And then gentrification is a huge problem. And gentrification is the next vocabulary word. It's the process of converting an urban neighborhood from predominantly low-income renter, that's spelled wrong, occupied areas to predominantly middle-class owner-occupied areas. So you get rid of the poor people and you move the rich people in. And the way to do that is to make the apartments nicer and to put more goods and services in there that rich people like to go. So you make a nice couple loft apartments and you put in a Starbucks and a Trader Joe's, boom, you're gentrified. This improves housing quality, it improves neighborhood livability, but it also makes it really unaffordable for existing residents because as property value increases, they can't afford to live there anymore. And so they are priced out, they have to move out, and they tend to either become homeless or be made to crowd into affordable housing somewhere else. And so as people are moving back into the inner cities in the United States, right, currently in a lot of places that ring around the CBD, the Central Business District, is an inner city. It's filled with low-income housing and businesses that cater to low-income residents, right? A lot of informal economy goes on in these places. But younger people, millennials, are wanting to move back towards the city. They're tired of the suburbs. The suburbs are soulless. They're rebelling against the ideals of their parents, and they want to move back in the city and live in a diverse place and be close to where it's at, right? And so they move into neighborhoods and gentrify them. But in their quest to become more diverse and become more socially aware, they are unwittingly sometimes making it really hard for the populations that they care about to make a living and to have affordable places to live. right? So millennials are quantifiably the least racist generation in America. However, they also really like nice things. And so they moving back into a groovy neighborhood and making it livable for them, these kids that grew up in white suburbs with services, make it unlivable for low-income residents who used to live there. Here is gentrification explained.
Gentrification is constantly being talked about. In the past 10 years, the number of Google searches for the word gentrification has more than doubled, and mentions in the news and in literature have gone up. So, people are talking about gentrification, but they often mean different things when they use the term. Gentrification is a process of neighborhood change that includes economic change in a historically disinvested neighborhood by means of real estate investment and new, higher-income residents moving in, as well as demographic change, not only in terms of income level, but also in terms of changes in the education level or racial makeup of residents. Gentrification is complex and needs some explaining. To understand it, there are three key things to consider: the historic conditions, especially policies and practices that made communities susceptible to gentrification, the way that central city disinvestment and investment patterns are taking place today as a result of these conditions, and the ways that gentrification impacts communities. Over the last century, many policies and practices have created racialized patterns of disinvestment in city centers that have left low-income communities of color particularly susceptible to gentrification. From the 1930s through the late 60s, standards set by the federal government and carried out by banks explicitly labeled neighborhoods home to predominantly people of color as risky and unfit for investment. This practice, now known as redlining, meant that people of color were denied access to loans that would enable them to buy or repair homes in their neighborhood. Other housing and transportation policies of the mid-20th century fueled the growth of mostly white suburbs and the exodus of capital from urban centers, in a phenomenon often referred to as white flight. Take the GI Bill as an example. The program guaranteed low-cost mortgage loans for returning World War II soldiers. But discrimination limited the extent to which Black veterans were able to purchase homes in the growing suburbs. In fact, the Federal Housing Administration largely required that suburban developers agree to not sell houses to Black people in order for the developers to access these guaranteed loans. Left behind in central city neighborhoods, low-income households and communities of color bore the brunt of highway system expansion and urban renewal programs, which resulted in the mass clearance of homes, businesses, and neighborhood institutions, and set the stage for widespread public and private disinvestment in the decades that followed. In more recent history, the foreclosure crisis also contributed to neighborhood-level vulnerability to gentrification. In low-income communities of color, disproportionate levels of subprime lending resulted in mass foreclosure, leaving those neighborhoods vulnerable to investors seeking to purchase and flip homes in bulk. Today, both people and capital are flooding back into these historically disinvested neighborhoods. One reason new people are moving into these neighborhoods is because of their relative affordability. In many U.S. cities, the rental market has gotten increasingly expensive, and even moderate-income earners are on the hunt for lower housing costs. This means that in some places, they are looking in historically disinvested communities, often the same neighborhoods previous generations left behind during the days of white flight. These neighborhoods are often characterized by older historic housing stock that appeals to new residents and close proximity to city centers, where jobs, restaurants, and art spaces are increasingly locating. Cities are also investing in revitalizing some of these neighborhoods, for example with improved transit access and infrastructure, in part to draw in newcomers. On the ground, gentrification may look like real estate speculation, with investors flipping properties for large profits, as well as high-end development, and landlords looking for higher-paying tenants. Increased investment in neighborhood amenities like transit and parks. Changes in land use, for example, from industrial land to restaurants and storefronts. And changes in the character of the neighborhood, as community-run businesses are replaced by businesses catering to new residents' needs. While increased investment in an area can be positive, gentrification is often associated with displacement, which means that, in some of these communities, longtime residents are not able to stay to benefit from new investments in housing, healthy food access, or transit infrastructure. Instead, lower-income families, often families of color, may find themselves facing rent increases, evictions, or other displacement pressures, and left with no other choice but to move to suburban or even exurban areas, far away from their jobs and the businesses and service providers they know. This can mean more time commuting, less time spent at home, and increased isolation, depression, and stress levels. For children, displacement can disrupt educational pathways and generate negative health impacts. Even for longtime residents who are able to stay in newly gentrifying areas, changes in the makeup and character of a neighborhood can lead to a reduced sense of belonging or feeling out of place in one's own home. For example, unique cultural vibrancy can be lost as places of worship see their congregants displaced to faraway cities and towns. In addition, family-run businesses and nonprofit organizations may be forced out as their customer base disperses, or as their commercial rents rise past what they can sustain, affecting the ability of those who stay to access the goods and services they need. There might also be changes in neighborhood norms and policing, for example, an increased police presence in order for new residents to feel safe. On the whole, we cannot ignore that the adverse impacts of gentrification, ranging from individual health effects to the suburbanization of poverty, are only the most recent wave in a pattern of urban restructuring that has been imposed upon and negatively affected low-income and communities of color over generations. Public, private, and nonprofit sector leaders have the opportunity to implement strategies that give longtime residents a chance to benefit from increased investment in their communities and even be part of driving how some of the changes in their neighborhoods take place. In order to invest in communities without displacement, policies, programs, and financing tools are needed to protect renters from formal and informal displacement pressures, facilitate the production of more affordable housing, and preserve and upgrade the existing affordable housing stock. Involving community residents in planning and decision-making about their neighborhoods and region can and should be a key piece of all three of these strategies. Taken together, these strategies can help keep communities together so that everyone can enjoy access to improved schools, better food options, more job opportunities, and safer neighborhoods. Qualities we know make cities and regions healthy and vibrant.
All right, that video too. Wait, what's this video? Is it the same one? No, it's not. That's confusing. Yes, we don't need to watch that again. All right, so that video too is a really great overview of how all of these things we've been talking about all year come together. That's why I teach urban last, because it really brings together a lot of the strands that we have been thinking of from all the way from Unit 1 into one big package. So again, as you're studying for the AP exam, make sure you're starting to see these connections and you're thinking of things on a larger platform than just memorizing the vocabulary. Think of scales of analysis, think of connectivity between all the models, think of how population influences agriculture, which then influences urban and industry, right? It's all in one big, giant AP Human Geography soup package. Okay, so in urban areas, overlapping levels of government can become very complicated. And we're not just talking federal and unitary here, right? So China is a unitary government, but each city and province seems to be doing slightly different things. I think the unitary governmental center said, here are all the things that you can do, and then each province and city enacted different things. And then within each province and city, there are more different things being enacted. Like outside my apartment complex, I have to walk through a tray of disinfectant before I come back into my complex. They have a big Tupperware tray out there with like a mat, and when you step in it, the disinfectant comes up through the mat and disinfects the bottom of your shoes. And they make me walk through that before I go into my apartment complex. I've seen this nowhere else, but it is something the manager of my complex decided to do. So these levels of government and levels of what we're going to do where are important. We're seeing this pan out in the United States today. Like the federal government wasn't doing anything, so school governments and school boards and organizers of cities started canceling things. The Big 12 basketball tournament in Kansas City was on, and then it was off. So people have traveled to come watch these games, but now they're not allowed to watch the games. So they've spent money to travel to Kansas City, but now they're not allowed in. The players are going to play it, but to empty stadiums, right? And so these decisions are happening at local levels on a scale of analysis, while the national level is doing different things. The national level wasn't doing much at all in the United States until this morning, when they canceled all flights coming in from Europe, and they put in some other measures to start the social distancing that seems to be required to stop this virus. And so these layers of government also present problems when you're trying to identify and solve urban issues. In the United States, there are 20,000 local governments, and there are 1,400 in the New York area alone. And these all overlap, and they all conflict. They all have different priorities on how to stay safe, right? So again, the coronavirus is a really, really good example of this. A city government will say close the schools, but the school board, looking at it from their scale of analysis, will say, but if we close the schools, this will happen. Universities, international students don't have places to go. In elementary and junior high schools, a lot of these kids depend on school lunch, right? So scale of analysis and scale of how you're looking at things really changes how a crisis like this works, and changes priorities that you might have. And urban problems tend to be approached from several different viewpoints and several different levels of priority. A couple of vocabulary words here. Municipal is the local government. It doesn't appear as often on the test as it used to, but I stuck it in because if you see it, I want you to know what it means. So the municipal government, the Kansas City, Missouri has a municipal government. That's the city government, basically, but the word municipal sometimes is applied to the city government. So it's the mayor and the city council, usually in the United States. So municipality refers to a local entity that's all under the same jurisdiction. You don't really hear it very much, but if you see something that says the Dallas-Fort Worth municipality, I would just want you to know that municipal and municipality basically mean city, basically mean an urban area. So in urban areas, every urban area has different things to do, and these little, particularly in the United States, these different exurbs and boom burbs and suburbs grow up around it, and then they have to figure out how to provide their own services or plug themselves into the services of the city they've grown up around. And so it's each municipality's responsibility to figure out how to handle those local services and coordinate with each other. You will often see the best coordination of these services in transportation, when they build roads together and create bus systems, and in larger metropolitan areas, subway and train systems. So the one solution to all of this is consolidation. You band together and figure out how to solve something together. So in the San Francisco region, there's a regional transit authority, the BART, the Bay Area Regional Transit Authority. So San Francisco is not in charge of the train system alone. The surrounding areas, the exurbs, the suburbs, and the boom burbs of San Francisco are all part of the Bay Area Regional Transport Authority. So BART gets to look at everything from a regional scale and make decisions. And there would be different decisions made if just San Francisco looked at transportation from a city scale, right? When you zoom out to the regional scale, you see different issues and you see different priorities, yes? Many cities also have special districts to solve problems, like I just said. So this is the Denver Regional Transportation Area. So there's all these little tiny cities and suburbs and parts of the metro area of Denver. And so this special district covers all of that so that they can make decisions as a larger unit. So layers of government and city planning. This is a good short video that outlines the levels of government: federal, state, regional, local, special districts. Even in unitary governments, there are layers, right? So in China, there's the unitary central government, but then there are province governments and city governments, right? And so the layers, though they might function under different names, are still in effect in unitary governments. Even though the idea of unitary government is that there's one central government, there are still layers. And so Shenzhen gets its marching orders from Beijing, right? In federal systems, Shenzhen would be able to make decisions on their own. But there are still layers, whether it's unitary or federal, there are still layers. In the unitary system, the layers all have to obey everything that the central government says. In the federal system, the layers have some autonomy. The state governments and the city governments have some autonomy. The federal government is in charge of some things in a unitary way, but the state systems and the city systems have some autonomy. So this is a short little video about how the layers of government work.
This probably goes without saying, but most city planning is done by cities. However, there are other layers of government that have an influence on city planning. In this video, I'm going to describe those layers of government, the relationships between them, and their effect on city planning. First things first, what layers of government am I talking about?
We have the federal government in Washington, D.C., we have the state governments, then regional agencies, then local governments, and finally special districts. Let's start at the top. Unlike some other countries, in the United States the federal government does not have the power to directly do planning in cities. It's not in the Constitution. In fact, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people. The federal government didn't call dibs, basically, and it was left to the states. That's not to say the federal government doesn't influence planning and city development. They just can't meddle with zoning codes or other city ordinances or plans. What they can do is provide funding to cities that come with strings attached. One of the biggest federal policies targeting cities over the last 100 years was urban renewal. This was the federal government's attempt to revitalize downtowns, remove slums, and build new housing. Urban renewal has a complicated and generally negative legacy, but it's a great example of how the federal government can influence cities. The federal government provided billions of dollars to local agencies established to spend money on urban renewal projects. This is often how federal dollars flow. They go to local or state agencies who exercise some local control over how the money is spent. Urban renewal is just one example. The Federal Highway Program, the Endangered Species Act, and the Tiger Infrastructure Grants are all federal policies that have an impact on cities. Let's move down a layer and talk about the states. As I mentioned before, the federal government can't directly influence local planning decisions, but states can. As a result, city planning can vary quite a bit between states. In Oregon, for example, the state requires every city to establish an urban growth boundary designed to limit suburban sprawl and increase urban densities. In this model, the state is an extremely active participant in local planning. In many states, local control is cherished and the state has a relatively small influence on local planning affairs. Sandwiched between the state and local level are the regional agencies. With the exception of Portland, Oregon, and the Twin Cities in Minnesota, regional agencies aren't governments, but they play a significant role in local planning efforts at a scale somewhere between the state and local level. Regional agencies were originally established at the behest of the federal government. The feds realized that it made more sense to dole out federal highway and transportation money to regions as opposed to each city and suburb separately. In many areas of the country, that's all regional agencies are. They produce regional transportation plans, receive money from the federal government, and implement the plans through infrastructure projects. In places like California, however, they have morphed into agencies that engage in region-wide housing and land use planning, as well as transportation planning. Recent California legislation puts them on the forefront of the state's efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well.
The problem with regional agencies is that they don't have the same authority as governments. Their influence primarily comes from the money they can distribute to cities and counties in the region for transportation projects. They have an influence to be sure, but it's somewhat limited.
Now let's move to local government. In most of the United States, local governments consist of cities and counties. Most people think cities reside within counties, which is true, but from a planner's point of view, cities and counties are co-equal governments that have their own distinct territories. City governments plan for the areas within their city limits, and counties plan for areas outside the city limits. Counties do not impose plans on the cities within its boundaries, but merely does the planning for unincorporated areas. And in many ways, city and county planning is similar, particularly in areas where a lot of people live in unincorporated suburbs surrounding larger cities. The entire Las Vegas Strip is in unincorporated Clark County, Nevada, not in the city of Las Vegas, for example. Finally, we arrive at special districts. This one may be a bit of a head-scratcher. What is a special district? Special districts are units of government that are independent from state and local governments and provide services to citizens. Common types of special districts include airport districts, cemetery districts, fire protection districts, harbor and port districts, healthcare districts, irrigation districts, library districts, mosquito and pest abatement districts, reclamation and levee districts, recreation and park districts, resource conservation districts, sanitation districts, transit districts, utility districts, veterans memorial districts, and water districts. Special districts can cross city and county boundaries, so it may not be totally appropriate to put them at the bottom of the list, but they have a much narrower set of responsibilities than the other government layers.
Those are all the layers of government that have an influence on city planning. As you can see, it's not as simple as the planning department down in City Hall, but it's an entire web of government programs and agencies. It's up to city leaders, community members, and planners to make sure all those layers of government are working together for maximum positive impact.
Okay, yes. So again, that video, again, beautifully. I love the videos in this section because they do such a better job of explaining things than I do, right? So the layers of government, what they're responsible for, and how it's different depending on where you are and how the government is structured and who's responsible for what. Yes? Okay. All right, our final topic of the year. Challenges of urban sustainability. Yes, yes. So we've talked a lot about all of this already, right? The suburban sprawl and brownfields, the things that challenge urban areas to be more sustainable, the things that are bad about urban areas, climate change, pollution, air and water quality, energy use, and then how regional planning efforts like he just talked about in that video, remediation is saving things and trying to make things better, redeveloping brownfields and urban renewal, urban growth boundaries, which he talked about in Oregon in the video we just watched, where you can grow within that boundary but not grow outside the boundary. So that's smart growth that we talked about and sustainable growth that we talked about. So all of this we basically talked about already, but we're going to talk about it one more time, right? And talk about some new things and some new vocabulary that we haven't said yet. So cities have an environmental impact in two important ways. The city structure itself is harmful to the natural environment. The concrete involved really wreaks havoc on all sorts of ecological systems. And then the high concentration of people in one location also affects the environment. We create a lot of carbon dioxide, we create a lot of poop, we create a lot of pee, we create a lot of trash, and when we're all crammed into one area, it creates problems, right? So simply by being alive, you're creating stress on the environment. That is your positive thought for the day, right? Okay, so a couple vocabulary words here. The physical landscape of urban areas really affects the natural environment. So there's things like urban canyons, which is a vocabulary word, where the buildings are so tall that natural wind patterns don't match, and you can create these giant, like, cyclones of air. So it can channel and intensify winds and really cause damage. It can also prevent natural sunlight from reaching the ground. This is how I feel whenever I go to New York. It feels like a big urban canyon to me, and I miss the sun and the blue sky, right? When you build a city, soils are compacted and replaced with surfaces that can't absorb water, like concrete and asphalt and streets and sidewalks and roofs. So rainwater has no place to go, which causes flooding. That's our red rain day, right? It's not that there's too much water falling from the sky. It's that our city is built in a way that it can't quite absorb that amount of water falling from the sky. There is also something called an urban heat island, right? When a concentration of buildings creates this kind of pocket of heat. So the central business district is often far hotter than the surrounding suburbs. And so the urban heat island is another reason sometimes people flee to the suburbs, right? It's cooler in the summer. Although with the development of air conditioning, which also has a giant environmental impact, heat islands are not as important. However, if more people need to use more air conditioning to create more spaces to be comfortable in, we're going to destroy the environment even more. So your two vocabulary words here are urban canyons and urban heat island. There's also urban wildlife, right? There's something I never see in Shenzhen. They're all over the place in the United States, the squirrel. Right? Squirrels are everywhere. They're these weird rodent things, right? And they're just everywhere. It's urban wildlife, and we don't even notice them. But living here, we don't see things like that. I've seen a couple rats, but we don't have squirrels, right? So wildlife is affected by the urban area. They destroy natural migration patterns. They destroy water systems and ecosystems that keep this alive. So a lot of species don't survive, but then a lot of species do and adapt to the city and then just kind of find ways to live in the city, which is a little dangerous. So deer and coyotes and skunks and alligators and bears and cougars and monkeys and leopards, all of these types of wild animals cause problems in cities because cities have invaded their natural territory and they figured out how to survive, but they've also they eat dogs and destroy small children sometimes, right? And obviously in the States we don't have monkeys, but in Thailand you do. We don't have cougars in the States, but you probably at much, but there are probably cougars in other places, right? Leopards in India versus cougars in Canada, right? So urban wildlife, this is called, not the wild animals that have adjusted to life in the city, but animals that thrive in the city, like rats, raccoons, and pigeons. I call pigeons the rats of the air, right? These they thrive in cities, but they spread disease, and they can be a nuisance whenever you see those pokey things out of a ledge, these wires poking up there to prevent pigeons from roosting there and destroying things, right? Feral and wild populations of cats and dogs, these animals that used to be pets that then run free, they can be dangerous and upset the ecological balance. So wildlife, true wild animals that are adjusting to city life, urban wildlife like rats, raccoons, and pigeons, and then escaped former pets can all cause problems. In Wiesbaden, Germany, there's an exotic bird. I can't remember what kind of exotic bird, but 2 exotic birds escaped sometime in the 1800s, and now there's an entire population of these types of exotic birds in a park in Wiesbaden, and it's crazy. It's like this these birds have adjusted, even though it's cold winter, and it's like suddenly this tropical wonderland of these weird kind of cockatiel-looking birds in Wiesbaden because it escaped from their owner, and that affects the ecology of that park in Wiesbaden, right? The normal types of animals that would live in that park don't live there anymore because of the invasion of the species. It's like finding that mandarin duck in New York, right? What was he doing there? All right, pollution. Obvious, right? We all live here in China. We understand pollution. So it's industrial and human waste that pollutes rivers, coasts, and aquifers. It produces the air, the cars we drive. In LDCs, poorer inhabitants burn charcoal and kerosene, and that contributes to pollution. And then there's some physical geography that traps pollution, right? Our pollution in Shenzhen is not as bad as maybe some other cities in China because we're near the ocean, so we get some of that ocean air. But we also have those hills and mountains that kind of sometimes trap us. Mexico City is surrounded by mountains, so pollution just kind of stays down there and infects the people's lungs. There's a theory of the COVID virus is much, since it's a lung virus, the pollution of China and the high levels of smoking in China have increased the death rate, right? If China had cleaner air and less of its population smoked, the number of people that have died might be fewer. That is yet to be proven, and we still have a lot to learn. Oh, so the World Health Organization, WHO, we're hearing a lot about them in the news if you're paying attention to the news. That's a non-governmental organization, but is also an international non-governmental organization, right? It works with the whole world. And so the WHO data shows that, or WHO data, you probably should say, 3 million deaths per year are caused by pollution, and 1 million of those deaths occur in China. You could probably say a lot of those COVID deaths so far in China, the underlying health issue that those people had who died might have been lung damage from pollution. Automobile pollution is enormous. Rising wealth increases the number of cars, and cars have emissions. And automobile pollution in more developed countries can be acute. So huge numbers of commuters, right? They live in the suburbs and they drive into the city to work and then they drive back, that 9 to 5 rush hour, right? And that creates a lot of pollution and it uses a lot of energy. And then there's congestion during rush hour. And congestion, if your car can't move, it still is turned on. And so it just spews emissions into the air like everybody else in that giant line of cars in that picture to the left. And that causes pollution problems. And then we've already talked about this, the urban and suburban sprawl, that a city can just go on forever, right? That's a city from the sky. And it just, you can see no end. It's all basically the same level. There's the field down there, and there's maybe a couple of roads cutting through, but I don't even see the central business district in this picture, right? And so cities grew vertically before we had cars. Now they grow horizontally because I can get in my car and get anywhere I want to go. I have full control. So interstates and other high-speed transport infrastructure encourage a sprawl. Land outside the urban areas is cheaper. That also encourages sprawl. That's why some places are enacting smart growth policies to kind of put a fence around this and say you cannot grow any farther. You're going to have to start growing up towards the sky, right? Vertically, because we cannot continue to pave the world. All right, regional planning efforts. This was talked about in the video. Overlapping governments try to solve problems. So this local government's website here is one of the organizations that tries to get local governments to plan for sustainability. And in the past several years, that ICLEI has really grown a lot and then attached its goals to the United Nations Goals for Sustainable Development. And so they're worldwide, globally, as a global community, the world together is trying to figure out these problems of urban sustainability and work on them together. So urban growth boundaries like smart growth and limited growth placed around the city and farmland protection policies all helps the world to grow a little bit more intelligently so that we still have a planet to live on when you are my age. Okay, so this is a walkable grid, sciencehowstuffworks.com. There's also a podcast on that page that's very interesting to listen to. If you haven't been to America and haven't really spent time in American suburbs, this is really important for you to engage with and understand. If American suburbs and that structure isn't familiar to you. We'll also dig into it when you watch America Revealed Nation on the Move. It will also talk about suburbs more, but you really need to understand suburbs in America. It's fairly unique to America, but it is prevalent to the urban problems in America, and remember, this is an American exam. The podcast is also very interesting on that page. I did not embed this video because it's like 30 minutes long. And don't watch it today, but come back after you finish the notes and after you've kind of got an understanding of everything. This video really puts everything in one wonderful little package. He actually even uses some AP Human Geography terminology that is really fun. Well, I find it fun, but I am an AP Human Geography nerd. All right, do you know what that's the sound of? That's the sound of being done with notes for the whole year in AP Human Geography. Woo! You now have all the content, right? You now have an iScore 5, which I hope you've downloaded and are starting to study. You have what you need, right? If there are things in iScore 5 that I haven't covered, send me an email so I know what I missed, right? And look them up. When you look up something, make sure you include the term AP Human Geography so you get that definition. There are other things that if you just look up the word, if you look at it from an economic standpoint or an agricultural standpoint, you're going to get more of the story. You don't need that much of the story in AP Human Geography. You want sometimes the limited definition. So you are done with notes, and our tests coming up. Our agriculture test is March 25th. Our industry test is April 1st, and our urban test will be April 8th. And I'm sorry they're all crammed together. I was hoping we'd be back in school by now and I could do things a little bit differently, but we aren't, and so I'm going to try to assess these assessments online and then give you some freedom to study for the test. So now that we're done with the urban unit, once you complete these urban assignments, the daily work requirement is going to ease up quite a bit. There are no more notes. The assignments will be review assignments, and several of them will be optional. You can review on your own, or you can take some of the review I'm giving you. So those of you who are way behind, you're going to have some time to catch up over the next couple of weeks, so don't panic. But if you are caught up, you're going to have the next couple of weeks to really throw yourself into review. And I'm still structuring how I'm going to do that, and I will let you know what I'm able to give you over the next couple of weeks. Congratulations, you are done with AP Human Geography test content.